Welcome to Behavioral Grooves. My name is Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. We have interesting conversations with insightful people about how to apply behavioral sciences to work and life. In this episode, we spoke to Ori Brafman, multiple New York Times bestselling author. His specialties range from organizational culture, employee engagement, business transformation, leadership, and even emerging technologies. Ori is the founder and president of Starfish Leadership and co-founder of the Fully Charged Institute with Tom Rath. And by the way, he's also the Distinguished Teaching Fellow at UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business.
Okay, so my life seems kind of insignificant in comparison.
Yeah, yours and mine both. Yeah, exactly.
Our talk with Ori was wide-ranging.
Yeah, like most of our interviews
Exactly. We touched on topics ranging from distributed trust, gaining power through ceding control in distributed or decentralized industries, making a new blockchain currency called Groove Coins.
Super cool. I love that idea.
Groove Coins. Do you think we'd be able to sell any of those?
I think we could sell 2.
Oh, one for you and one for me?
I think so.
All right. Maybe not the best idea.
Well, we also discussed how being born in Israel and growing up in El Paso, Texas, impacted Ori's life, how communities and tribes impact our behaviors, and how we do or do not imply intent in the way that we communicate. We talked about cash and cocaine.
Cash and cocaine.
Oh, why not, right? We talked about how technology is a huge behavioral science experiment. And we also got to spend some time on the new podcast that he and his brother are working on called Psychological Mysteries.
And of course, we talked about music.
Yeah, how did we get to that?
I don't know. Always that seems to happen. Anyway, I recommend for our listeners, go out and check out Psychological Mysteries. Great podcast.
Yeah, it was a great interview. We covered lots of ground, and it was lots of fun.
All right. Before you listen, we would like to ask your help. Stars and written reviews really help move us up in Apple and in other pod services algorithms. On Apple, in order to leave us a review or to give us some stars, all you have to do is click on shows, find Behavioral Grooves, scroll down to the bottom past all of our episodes, and rate us or write us a review. If you could do that, we would greatly, greatly appreciate it. It helps in getting the word out about Behavioral Grooves and build our community to make it even larger.
Yeah, greatly appreciate it. If you're one of the 49% of our listeners listening at home, then we hope that you sit back with your favorite listening beverage and enjoy our very interesting discussion with Ori Brafman. Welcome, Ori Brafman, to the Behavioral Grooves podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, guys.
It's great for you to be here. We're really excited about this. Thanks for coming. Yeah. We're gonna start with a quick speed round, and we're just gonna start with something that you've already anticipated: bicycle or unicycle?
Definitely bicycle.
Life without a mobile phone or without a computer?
Which would you rather have? Without a mobile phone?
Yeah, without a mobile phone.
Yeah, I started talking with my students. Whenever you talk about your mobile phone, insert the word crack instead of mobile phone and see if it makes sense. Like, oh, I left my crack at home.
It really is, though, isn't it? It has become kind of that dopamine release form that we just have. We carry around in our hands, and it's perfectly legal. So
yeah, I've made mine in. There's a setting you can make it black and white, so it's a little bit less crack.
Oh,
which is also kind of worrisome that you're carrying around this thing with you that you're like, I have to protect myself from it.
yeah, kind of insane. Okay, travel with a set itinerary or no itinerary?
No itinerary.
No itinerary.
Wow.
All right. Would you rather be a spider or a starfish?
The combo is special, but probably a starfish these days.
There you go. Yeah. Which leads us into, one of your big books was, The Spider and the Starfish. Give us like just the 30,000 foot overview of what that book was about. I know it was many years ago, but it still is some power.
Book.
Yeah.
Thank you. So the central metaphor is that you cut the head of a spider and it dies, but you cut off the arm of a starfish and it grows one back.
Right.
And that's because, unlike the spider, the starfish doesn't have a central brain. And you think about that as a metaphor for business and society. Everything from Alcoholics Anonymous to Wikipedia are very starfish-like organizations without top-down structure. And you see more and more examples by the day. Everything from the Tea Party to blockchain to everything in between.
Very interesting.
What do in the book you talked a lot about the music industry in the days when Napster and Kazaa were actually gaining a lot of prominence, and how how the big labels didn't really respond all that well. Could you imagine a world where Napster and Kazaa actually just got deep sixed? What can you imagine a world where they didn't really gain that much power? Or do you think it was inevitable?
That's a great question. I think it was inevitable that every industry tends to shift from more centralized to decentralized and back and forth. And that it's, if you have an industry that is overly centralized, people are going to feel disempowered and figure out ways to collectively be able to gain powers, whether it's sharing music or whether it's doing commerce on Bitcoin.
Okay.
So I think it was somewhat inevitable. I think, though, that the response from the music industry at first to try and crush these made the problem worse. But it's been interesting that over the last decade or so, music has really shifted from, or the money shifted from recording to really live performances. And that people are oftentimes eager to give away their music, knowing that you're going to show up at a concert. And it's interesting that sometimes we gain power by ceding control, which is kind of a new
kind of way. It is interesting, I think, that whole music business dynamic, particularly from the artist perspective, right? The artist perspective is very different today than it was 10, 15, definitely 20 years ago, when you're looking at it from the perspective of where their revenues are coming from. Because places like Spotify, Pandora, all of those elements, and Tim will talk about this off your ear off. You make no money of that as an artist, or relatively little, unless you're really one of the huge, recording artists out there. While giving away that music seems kind of opposite of what most people would think about doing. But if it draws, you get the crowd, you get a YouTube channel, you get everything else that goes on today. It really is kind of kind of detangled from that record label of yesteryear.
Yeah, and you have to wonder what will happen as more disintermediation happens, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, is there an even more decentralized approach than Spotify? Will there be a day one day where fans can directly purchase through blockchain a subscription to your content, and if they pay a few pennies for it in aggregate, do you need the middleman always?
Yeah.
That's wild. I mean, honestly, that is sort of a next level evolution in that model. I wonder what that would be like for Airbnb or Uber, where there really is hardly even a centralized system at all, to manage those kinds of things, because those are very community based organizations.
Do you see an industry where that's ripe for, that is moving in that direction?
I think, Tim, you just mentioned a couple of them. I think Uber, who knows, right?
Yeah.
So you talk about Uber, whatever percentage they take these days, it's not completely efficient as a market. So if you can potentially distribute trust even more, right, where you have and you start thinking about these potential micro communities.
Okay.
That let's say we arbitrarily decided to have commerce on some kind of currency, blockchain currency.
Okay.
We'll call it the groove coin. Okay. And
Perfect. That's our favorite currency.
I like that coin.
Yes.
So I don't know what particular skills the three of us might have. Maybe there's music creation. We can philosophize. We can. So maybe we'll bring in a few other people into our little community. People who maybe have medical training or legal training or whatever it is. And let's say there's a community now of 100 or a couple hundred people. Within that community, if all the commerce is done using this coin, then do you really need, and this sounds kind of out there, but do you really need a lot of the elements that society provides? Or can you have those alone you can kind of live in this little technological island where everything from an Uber ride to music can be provided within this small community?
With the groove coins, as opposed to using dollars or yen or whatever other currency is out there.
Right. And is that a feasible economic approach as people start feeling burnt out in some ways from, I guess, the bigger system?
Well, is this metaphorically sort of like getting off the grid in smaller ways, getting off the grid with electricity? I have friends now who they live in the suburbs and they have, these lovely houses, but they have these beautiful southern facing roofs, and they've loaded up the roof with photocells, and they're basically selling electricity back to the energy company.
Yeah, so I live in San Francisco. Our house has a solar panel on the roof, and I don't think we're energy neutral yet. There isn't that much sun in San Francisco, but
Yeah,
You get a foggy day every now and then.
I try. But yeah, that's the idea, right? Can you create? And I think in certain ways we do live in technological islands. We already live in technological islands when it comes to our maybe social networks. But can we do more commerce with one another? And is there a thirst for that? And I think,
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. You talked about when you started talking about that, it was this distribution of trust, right? And trust, I think, is that key piece.
Yeah.
As you're talking about that, and Dan Ariely talked about this when we were at a conference with him about a month ago now, and just the elements of trust and the difference that trust makes in any of our interactions with other people, and the power that we forget how hard life would be if we didn't have trust.
Right. Or living in a world without trust just creates enormous amounts of deadweight loss. Just almost unfathomable, right? But it's still around us, right? And the smaller and more immediate the community, the easier it would be to not have that, right? The easier it would be to have more trust, right? Is that kind of what you're thinking, Ori?
Precisely. So let's say you have a group of 10 people that you know and trust really well. Let's say these are people that you've known for a long time. And then let's say each one of them is able to vouch for 10 other folks. So all of a sudden you have a community of 100 people where no one is more than 1 degree of separation away from saying that this is someone who I really deeply trust. And if you can verify that and okay, you're part of this community, then think of how much effort we spend on a daily basis dealing with potentially untrustworthy people, right? And making sure that they don't screw us over.
Yeah, it is absolutely out there. It is absolutely a part of our world. But I also want to just return to this idea of the micro community having its own currency. How would services fit into this? How would sort of the big things that we lean on our larger scale communities for, like electricity or paved roads and sewage and water, things like that? How would those work in your incredibly well developed model here?
I feel like a technological hippie here. So let's see. I think that we're not going to be able to disintermediate paved roads and water, and you're going to have to integrate with within society for those. I think though electricity, we're finding out that we can be pretty independent, and is there going to be a thirst? So living here in California and in San Francisco, there is definitely a sense of it's hard to explain. I think maybe a thirst for community, and California, San Francisco, I would say, isn't terribly religious oriented. So there still is a thirst to belong to something, to some community, and we have. I think the religion of San Francisco probably comes from Burning Man, the arts festival.
Awesome!
It really is, right?
It's terrific.
And you think about the norms of Burning Man, and Burning Man is very much about distributed decision making, about not a whole lot of control,
Right.
And you think about what might be some of the second and third order effects of having a lot of technological folks and CEOs show up at the event and have such an influence on them. So.
It's funny that you mentioned it. We had a discussion with Caroline Webb, who is this British author that wrote a wonderful book called How to Have a Good Day. And it's incredibly well researched and very buttoned up. And geez, Caroline is, she's, Davos, she goes to Davos and she's an economist by training, very, very buttoned up. And then it's sort of I think it was after our conversation, we said, so what do you like to do for fun? She said, oh, my husband and I like to go out to Burning Man.
Yeah. So it used to be about 10 years ago, people would be like, well, I'm going to a trip to the desert. And it was... And now
which was code, right? It was code for going to Burning Man. Like if it's, late summer, early September, right?
Yeah. And so my brother gives me a lot of... it gives me a hard time for going, and he's like, you go there and you pay money to use porta potties and
and suffer from the heat and the dust.
Suffer from the heat and dust and complain. And to a degree, he's right, and to a degree, I think he misses that there is a spiritual component to it.
Right.
And have you guys been yet?
Not yet.
Tim is actually making plans.
Yeah.
So
he's
looking forward to it.
Yeah.
2019.
Yes.
Oh, this year or
next year? Yeah.
Soon to be this year.
Soon to be this year.
Yeah.
I think in terms of school years.
I have kids as well. It is the 18-19 school year. There you go. There you go.
Go ahead. Did you?
Well, no, I was just I think there's an element that you're talking about from the Burning Man and that spirituality component of it that is this community aspect, right? There's a community of people that go that have a similar outlook. I mean, if you go to Burning Man, it means you're probably going there with an idea of what it stands for. And definitely if you're a return person. And so you're going and you're self-selecting into this community. It's one of the things that we try to do we started Behavioral Grooves as a meetup because we wanted people to get together and build a community to talk about and to learn about behavioral science. And again, people are self-selecting into these communities. Do you see that self-selection with the technology growing? Or does it need, as in Burning Man, there's a face-to-face component that I think you wouldn't get. It couldn't just be an online Burning Man. It wouldn't be the same. Is there something there?
Yeah, I don't think it could be an online Burning Man just yet. Maybe with virtual reality, but I think we're far from that. And
right.
I do think that we are thirsty for common spirituality and common community. And you're right that there is a code that if I know someone went to Burning Man, I'm more likely to return their emails or to act in more community according to the community norms.
Right.
So you
Wow.
too will be ingratiated, and then you'll you'll get a little card.
I'll be out. I'm not going. I'm
You
gonna
have to
be
come.
the out group, and Tim's gonna be the in group. That won't bode well with me.
Ori, we need to convince Kurt to go. We need
Yes,
to convince
Kurt.
Kurt to go. Yeah.
Are you thinking about it, Kurt? Would you consider it?
I would. I think at this point I have 2 young children, and so just the logistics of actually going.
You're a responsible human being. Okay, I get it.
I don't know if I would go that far away. I don't think responsible is the right word.
I have a question for you. I'm curious about you come to the United States. You're young, and you move to you grow up in El Paso, Texas, basically. How does that inform your view? How does that impact this life experience that you've had?
Gosh, what a great question. So you're right. I was born in Israel and grew up in Texas, which gives me a really weird accent. People people have guessed Canadian. No one's ever guessed, oh, that sounds like an Israeli Texan accent.
Yeah, right. Which is pretty common, right?
Yeah, right.
Pretty much everybody has got an Israeli Texan accent.
So growing up in Israel, and moving to Texas, Israel was the worldview was relatively insular. To imagine having neighbors, and I mean nation neighbors, as friends was you're surrounded by so-called enemies.
Mm-hmm.
And El Paso is such a border town, so it borders both Mexico and New Mexico. It was such a welcoming place. It was really gave me a sense of these different communities that already existed, and I would say that in El Paso probably the communities between Mexico and Texas already existed, and then there's an arbitrary border that doesn't mean much in terms of families or in terms of I really felt a sense of belonging there and a sense of acceptance, and also frankly seeing the vast economic inequality growing up really shaped me as who I am. And unfortunately, we're seeing more of that in San Francisco, where I live, the economic inequality. And I think as a country, unfortunately, we are seeing more exclusionary behavior or trends. And I think that we need to really overcome that. And I think we overcome that with community and with a sense of belonging to something.
Yeah. We were just talking actually before we got on, we were talking about various different elements of how do you get past that component of they're so different from us if they're not part of our immediate community or if they're not part of our tribe, right? And so we have this component where we believe the out group is so vastly different when in fact most of the time we cross over at very high percentages of what we want as individuals, as humans, as how we think about the world. But those differences get magnified and we tend to over analyze or think that they're so different than us.
Yeah, I'll tell you 2 quick stories. One was of 9-year-old me, and when I was put in school, one of my best friends was this guy named Amir, and his dad was Syrian. And lo and behold, my world was blown up, saying, "Wow, the Syrian kid and I were very similar, and we had far more similarities than we did any differences." Although growing up, I perceived someone from Syria as the quote enemy. And you fast forward about, 3 decades. I did my undergrad at Berkeley. I was a peace and conflict studies major. I started a vegan nonprofit, and I do a lot of work now with the U.S. military. So I was in this hunting lodge in Kansas, in this middle of nowhere in Kansas, surrounded by all these animal heads, like trying to order a vegan thing off the menu. And
good luck.
Right? And I'm talking to this guy who I'm running a program for a bunch of Army officers. And he talks to me about bow hunting and says, there maybe aren't so many differences between he kind of says, "Oh, well, you Berkeley guys you don't seem all that bad." And I'm like, "Oh, well, thanks."
Wow.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah, right. And really recognizing that when you put politics aside, there's probably very little that actually divides us, and it's this really notion of separation. I think it's getting exactly what you're saying, is getting increasingly magnified, and I don't think is doing us any good. And how do we focus again on what connects us?
Yeah, what are those connectors as opposed to the components? And I think it's being done purposefully on the political perspective.
You think? What was you say that?
Kirk,
Wait a second.
Captain Obvious.
Captain Obvious, right?
But I think there's even some components of this. I'm just moving on. I'm not even going there. We got that handled there. But I think there's this other aspect that then bleeds over into other aspects of our lives that we don't even realize. And so this element of us versus them, good guys, bad guys, attributing intent when we don't have any idea around intent. And that intent is usually, if it's the out group, it's usually bad. If it's the in group, it's always good, regardless of what the outcome is.
Right.
And there's all these factors that go into it. And I think things like Burning Man, and we were talking earlier, I'm part of a Rotary Club, and we bring variety, I have all these different people that are in this Rotary Club. We're doing great work. And I don't see them as Republicans or Democrats or old or young or whatever, arbitrary kind of line that you put into
when
it.
you're raking leaves, you're just helping somebody clean their yard.
We're raking leaves, or we're helping out at the food bank or the food shelf. And I think the more that we can build some of those communities that bring different people together, like you said, you're in a hunting lodge in Kansas with these people, and hey, Berkeley guys aren't all that bad.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, you even look at Rotary and the huge effect that it's had. It's on global polio, right? Eradicating polio, and Rotarians have done so much for this. And what you see is a pattern over and over and over again. And I keep on forgetting about the importance of this. But the pattern is that you get people with shared values who work together towards a common cause.
Yeah.
Right. And lo and behold, when that happens, we all get along really well, and we can accomplish amazing things. And yet I even find myself so on a regular basis really thinking about that person or them. And I keep on being challenged with my view of them and how oftentimes it's, it's a story. Yeah.
Isn't something like over 99% of human DNA the same, like across all human beings? Isn't something north of 99% of all of our DNA is identical? That all the differences in hair color and eye color and physical characteristics and all these kinds of things are all capsulated in just a very tiny percentage of our DNA. We just lose sight of that so easily.
Yeah.
All right. We
okay.
we
That's
tend to go down rabbit holes and various it's part of what we do. So
you had me thinking about water for some reason. That apparently there hasn't been a lot of new water on Earth for millions of years.
Yeah. So we're drinking the same water that's been around.
We're drinking the same water. Yeah. So there you go. Next time you have a glass of water, think about that. The dinosaurs.
The dinosaur the dinosaurs had, right?
Yeah,
there we go.
Exactly.
So another book that you wrote along with your brother, I'm moving on. So here we go. Captain Obvious here. Was Sway.
Loved it.
And it was one of those books that I think encapsulated a time period where behavioral economics was just starting to come into the mainstream. Nudge was made that same year, I believe, that you guys published Sway, and you captured this component of, again, great book, and various different things. And it has one of Tim's all-time favorite lines from a book in it.
Truly.
And I'm going to read it and just...
you're going to get it right.
I'm going to read it and get it right here.
Yeah. This is...
and it's about this component. It says, and the more money there is on the line, the more the pleasure center lights up. A monetary reward is, biologically speaking, like a tiny line of cocaine.
I love that.
And they let us keep it in. I'm so happy they let us keep that.
Were the publishers nervous about that?
I don't remember if they were nervous about that specific line, but we were great relationship with our publisher, and but I was afraid that they'd be a little bit like, wait a second, and
that I read the book shortly after it came out, and just that line just like that said it all for me. That just really captured it. Well, for me, this whole idea of monetary rewards, just to be able to say that, we're gonna strive for this. We're going to basically seek the same kind of experience that we have as we get with cocaine. That was just a mind-blowing idea. 10 years ago, I thought that was just terrific. And again, and as Kurt framed it, so much. I don't know. I guess at that point, like Predictably Irrational had been written, Dan's book, but so much literature had yet to be exposed, had yet to be unfolded, and so that was just a mind-blowing concept.
And that we did so much for the sake of community and for the sake of each other, and that if you can just expose that part of human behavior, or we can just concentrate on that, then boy, people don't act like cokeheads, which is that kind of want a company where I want that company.
Right. And there's an interesting component about that. And so thinking about where behavioral economics and behavioral science has come in the past 10 years. So it's been 10 years in there, and the Richard Thaler getting the Nobel Prize and just the kind of explosion of this. Where do you see, from where you sit, I mean, where do you see behavioral economics going? Where do you see behavioral science kind of going in the next 10 years? Is there any thoughts on that?
That's a great question. I think we're all parts of very large social experiments with technology, and we're starting to really see the effect that mass exposure to, say, social media and its effect. And there's going to be there already is good data that lives within a lot of these companies, but even to the level of, to my understanding, so if you have an iPhone, if you iMessage someone, you get a really nice blue response. It's a very nice color. If you have another iPhone, if you message someone who doesn't have an iPhone, you get the ugly green.
Yes.
Now, I always thought that was just, that's just like how it is. But no, that's actually there by design.
Sure.
That green is there to make you feel that the other person is other, and they found the ugliest green that they could.
I did not know that.
Wow. So I've been thinking about. I didn't know whether to ditch my iPhone or not in favor of an Android phone, and a big reason, honestly, was I didn't want to be the green guy. I didn't want to be. I was like,
wow, that's
the social pressure of leaving the group was too high for you.
The stupid blue and green group, right? But you don't want to be.
Wow.
God forbid it should be a green. So I think that now that we have the behavioral economics lens, and I think there's so much that's being uncovered about human behavior. And
right.
Just you think about the ding every time someone likes a Facebook post or something like that. Much to my friend's chagrin, I quit Facebook about 6 months ago. I was having dinner with a student, and we're talking about kind of how Facebook really is a little bit like a dopamine hit, and and I was like, I'll quit. I'll show them. I'll quit. And I don't know if you've ever tried to quit Facebook. So I took it out of my I took it off of my phone.
Okay.
But then I found myself mysteriously then checking it on using the browser version, and so I decided to quit. And you go to the quit page, and they say, "We're sorry to see that you're thinking about leaving, but we're going to give you a 2-week kind of cooling off period."
A cooling off period.
They don't call it a cooling off period, but it's basically a cooling off period where your account doesn't actually get deleted for another 2 or 3 weeks. I'm like, wow, I've been really a part of this social experiment, haven't I?
God. Yes. Yeah, truly. I mean, so this is that if there's any amount of regret, and of course there almost always is, like, regret's such a profound and common attribute in the human condition.
So you're calling it regret, which is a very nice word for withdrawal.
Yeah.
That's what I was just going to say. We're probably not you. We're probably addicted much more so than we ever think. I mean, when you said, "Oh yeah, take it off your phone and just have it there," but then you're going to the browser to actually do it. It's like
that's addict behavior.
Who's my new dealer? My dealer's gone. I got to go find my new dealer.
I got to find my fix.
I'm going downtown, San Francisco, trying to find a Wi-Fi so I can get on, I really do think you're at that point of we're all in this larger social experiment. Even there's within Uber, within Airbnb, we've talked with some of the chief behavioral scientists.
Yeah, Candace Hogan at Airbnb and Charlene Wu Candace Hogan at Uber and Charlene Wu at Airbnb.
And they are running thousands of experiments all the time because of the technology, and they can do that. And so again, how you word something, does that make a difference in how many clicks go through and all those different things? And it's just at some point they're going to know people so well. This is an ethical question that we have all the time, is that they're just going to be able to, we're going to be robots because they're going to give us the right message and we're going to do, they say X and we'll do Y.
Right.
So
if we look at social media through the lens of a substance, right? So I know that if I have a glass of wine, maybe I shouldn't drive, and I know that's going to impact my behavior in certain ways. Similarly, should you start thinking about, hey, if I've had exposure to social media or to X or Y, because it's been that well calibrated, should I then think that I'm under the influence of some substance? And the data is suggesting that exposure, I think about after 15 minutes or so to social media, is very similar to how you look at exposure to illicit substances.
Wow. Well, speaking of, okay, I'm going to switch off of substances, but speaking of a grand social experiment, you're launching a new podcast.
Yes, it's with my older brother Ram, and it's called Psychological Mysteries.
So tell us about it.
So Ram is a psychologist, and there are still these unsolved psychological questions. That I've kind of left psychologists scratching their heads, and each episode we look at one mystery. And for example, how much does parenting really matter?
Right.
Is it going to have an effect or not? Another one is narcissism always a bad trait? Or can little doses of it be useful? And Ram gives me a quiz in the beginning of every episode, and I try my best to pass the quiz, but I always I do horribly on it. It shows who the brains are in the family, and and then we analyze it. So we're just launching it.
How? Tell me about this question of, is parenting even worth it? How? It's hard for me to imagine this idea that parenting.
Parenting. So So it turns out that when you look at the large data, that parenting on average doesn't really make much of a difference, except for on the extremes. And there's been a lot of studies on very negative parenting having a huge psychological effect on kids. And there hasn't been as much research, though, on how parenting might really make a difference with very, very positive parenting. And we start looking at that. So we know in the extremes that it really does make a difference. should then parents really think about, okay, rather than thinking about I'm an average parent, what would it look like to be an unbelievably supportive dad? And
Right.
what might be some of the effect on kids? So, yeah, it's a topic that when you start looking at, you realize that we can actually make a difference on the extremes, and hopefully we choose the positive.
Right.
Well, we'll definitely put psychological mysteries. We'll put a link to it in the show notes because I think people should be aware of
Well,
that.
if they're
and
interested in
check it
this,
out.
they're going to be interested in that. So
Yeah,
there
well,
you go.
I am. I'm ready to subscribe. I'll tell you that.
All right, Tim, is it time to talk music?
Yeah, of course.
Tim always gets the biggest smile at this point of the interview.
Well,
So
I
here we
just
go.
think it's so much fun, right? Music is such an interesting aspect to all of our lives. Whether it's, oh, I just listened to whatever's on Spotify or my Pandora playlist, or oh yeah, I was in a band in college, or whatever it is. I think that there's always something. You have an interesting musical background.
So I used to work at Tower Records when it still existed, and I wanted to play violin, and by that I mean like I played it through high school and wanted to be a music major, and discovered freshman year that I absolutely sucked, which is my parents knew all along, but they were very supportive and kind parents, which was in a weird way kind of a gift because I have friends who were much better musicians than I am, and boy, it's a struggle trying to make a living purely from music, and I'm glad that got kicked.
You're fortunate, actually.
Yeah, I'm really glad
early
to
on.
have sucked at 18, as opposed to being really good and then being upset all life that it's hard to make a living from it. So of course I chose writing, which is so much easier.
All right. Oh, that's a breed.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Obviously. So with all that access, I mean, at Tower Records, it must have been like a kid in a candy shop, right? I mean, to have access to all this great music. Did you get to see a lot of great shows? Was there, you're always probably on the forefront of the latest and the newest stuff that was coming out.
Yeah, I was at that time there was a lot of Baroque stuff coming out on authentic instruments, and that was
Okay.
Yeah, right. So you're.
I love it. I went to the Conservatory of Music in Kansas City, so I'm with you.
So all this music being played on authentic instruments, which is especially if you listen to string music, it's almost if you listen to side by side of say Vivaldi's even Four Seasons and listen to it on a traditional recording versus authentic recording, it's so different and so much lighter, more improvisational, and I got very into ancient music in college. Yeah.
So when you talk about authentic instruments, would these be is a synonym for that period instruments?
Correct. Period instruments.
Okay.
So it's a slightly different bow and different strings, and just the physical instrument itself is a violin looked a little different.
Yeah, so let's go back to Vivaldi's Four Seasons, right? So he's in Venice. He's writing all this fabulous music, and he's got a small band of musicians that are playing these things. How would the performance be different with these period instruments than it would be with modern violins, violas, etc.?
To my understanding, it was a lot less structured. There would be more improvisation within each piece.
Oh,
and there might be, depending on the instruments that you could get a hold of, from performance to performance, you might hear some more variance than we'd hear today. So
each musician had the authority or ability to sort of go, oh, I think I'm just going to add some melisma here.
Your soloist would, your soloist would within a piece. So it I guess maybe a way of thinking about it is it's more like a dead concert. Like they would jam more.
That's kind of cool.
That's a good in San Francisco. Yeah, there you go.
Right, it all comes together.
Right? It all comes together.
Which it actually did. I was wandering around Burning Man a few years ago, and lo and behold, I stumbled onto this camp of one of the big Baroque performance people. And I was like, wow, my worlds have collided. Burning Man and
That's perfect.
with like EDM music playing in the background. I was like, yeah, this is.
And so you mentioned that at the beginning too. So now you're getting into EDM music, and so how does that square with your Baroque classical background? Is it just a natural progression, or is it just a new phase?
I don't know. So I went from ancient music to having deep love for 80s like new wave, so the Smiths, the Cure, and it's hard for me to explain why I'm so drawn to EDM. Maybe because it I really like the sampling and resampling that DJs do, and have a few friends who are DJs, and you really a good DJ from performance to performance isn't going to sound the same. So there is kind of the jazz element to it.
It's a Dead concert again, right?
Exactly.
There you go.
Yeah. Maybe I should compare it to jazz rather than to Dead. But
Well, that'd be more highbrow.
Yeah,
but,
exactly.
But it still works. It totally works.
Yeah.
That is so cool. Well, that's really fun. Thank you for sharing those observations with us, Ori. Really, really appreciate that. And thank you for your time today. This is we have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.
This was fun.
Yeah,
So
it's really fun. It flew by.
Yeah.
Hopefully for the listeners as well.
Conversations that go to Burning Man, to Baroque music, to
Right? Or Baroque music at Burning Man, which is
yeah. How about that?
Yeah, how about that?
Yeah, how about that? Yeah.
All right. Well, Ori, thank you.
Yes, and we wish you good luck on the psychological mysteries podcast, and we're gonna promote that in our notes. I think that'd be great for our listeners to sort of check that out, find a new community, dig in.
Thanks, guys.
Welcome to our grooving session, where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our behavioral groups interview, have a free-flowing discussion on some of those topics, and whatever else comes into our widely decentralized and distributed brains.
Thank you, Ori.
Thought you'd like that. So, Tim, what caught your attention with our conversation with Ori?
There were several things.
Okay.
Burning Man struck me. The discussion about cocaine, of course, and bringing that up because that's what caught me in the book the very first time. That was a cool thing. The social circles caught me. But I want to start with decentralization.
Okay. What about decentralization do you want to talk about?
Well, it rang a bell to me because this goes back to a 1982 book written during the time of organizational behavior, kind of focusing on the organizational commitment of the citizenry, like looking at employees as citizens with sort of the rights and things like that. And there was this book that was written by Richard Moday in 1982 called Employee Organizational Linkages, The Psychology of Commitment, Absenteeism, and Turnover. And the authors basically said, decentralization is a good thing.
And why is that?
Well, because it gives us that sense of context, like, oh, decisions are being made, things are happening in right around me that are actually guided by by people who I'm working with, rather than some anonymous, central hierarchy or bureaucracy.
So people feel that they have more control over their work life in this decentralized element because they have a greater line of sight into where decisions are being made. They may have a greater influence into the areas where those decisions are being made. It isn't some foreign entity that is off in some corporate headquarters in New York.
Exactly.
They are decisions are being made right here in this local facility, plant, whatever it would be.
And so here we are 30 years after this book has been written, and we have the rise of blockchain. Sort of the ultimate in decentralization, right?
Right. And he talks about that, I think, really interesting in thinking through the analogy of that spider versus the starfish.
Yeah, it's a great image.
And the element of, hey, you lop off the head of a spider, the spider's dead. Actually, if you lop off a couple legs of the spider is injured. Whereas the starfish grows a new leg or various different things. It's very hard to kill that starfish. And the element of a decentralized program, industry, company, service, again, is very difficult to kill off.
Or even had he had a specific thing that he said about power. Wasn't there a note that he made about how the distributed
ceding control leads to power, right? Right. So he talked about ceding control in distributed or decentralized industries. And really that was that conversation he had about music, music today. And we talked about the component of how musicians are ceding control over the rights to the music itself, right? You're not getting much money from selling the songs anymore. You're giving those away, but you're getting a different stream of revenue through advertising on YouTube channel, because a lot of people are now there, or performances, etc.
It is also interesting with the music industry discussion to think about this idea that musicians could bypass the distributors entirely and go straight to the consumers. I still believe that there's value in the aggregation of ideas. Like it's easy for me to go to a bookstore and browse, whether it's online or in person, because then I get to see a lot of authors that I wouldn't normally see.
Right.
Which might make this very personal distribution model difficult. Who's going to find out about me as an artist unless I'm next to or displayed near an artist that they are already familiar with?
Right. I think it comes back into some things on social media that we've talked about, and the way that we consume news and information these days, which doesn't have that centralized kind of component to bring things all together. Now we're actually getting segregated away because the way that the AI works around that, you see things that you have liked before, so then you get deeper down that rabbit hole of different components. And so there is, I think, a role for some of this centralization. But to his point, gosh, it seems like the world is really moving into this decentralized world.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
Kurt, what was the most important thing that you came away with from Ori's?
Groove coins. Yeah. Just the name Groove coins. Come on, man. Bitcoin, Groove coin. We could those grew I forget hundreds of thousands, and we could just sell a few of them and we could then retire. Don't you think?
Let's just do it. Let's just scrap this whole podcasting thing.
Yeah,
let's just do
Groove coins. No, what was interesting, though, is he talked about distributed trust with that. And that gets back into the whole blockchain component. It gets into your decentralized element. And this element of blockchain, which is really about distributing trust across variety of different people. And I think it was really interesting. Rachel Botsman, who is a professor and talks about a business professor and talks about this stuff, talks about how we've gone through 3 different iterations of trust, right?
Yeah.
There was this first element where we had local trust based on that one-on-one interaction, those kind of personal connections that you have, all of that component of going into there. Moved into institutional trust. You had to trust the institutions, whether that be organization, government, local community organizations, your record company or your news organization to bring you all of this interesting piece. But now we're going away from that, right? We're losing trust in at least some of those organizational pieces, and we're moving to this distributed trust, which takes that component of any single source having the trust and distributes it across many people.
Yeah. So I wonder, been reflecting on this since we talked to Ori, and I wonder how much of that is cultural.
Okay.
So how does, again, if I think about the way our biases tend to be regionalized, right? That we think about, I'm more apt to buy a stock in a company that I can see on my way to work than I am a company that I don't ever see, face to face.
Right.
So is this distributed trust more apt to happen in an environment where there's already a cultural environment, a context in which people are already pretty trustworthy with each other, where there is either good institutional trust and good interpersonal trust?
See, I think actually distributed trust, at least in the way that blockchain, and I am not an expert in blockchain at all. And so if I've totally messed up my understanding of this, listeners, please let us know. But the beauty of that distributed trust in a blockchain is it doesn't matter if you know them. It doesn't matter how...
Because the system itself is transparent.
Right,
and
because it
trustworthy.
is the system and the way that blockchain works and saying, I'm going to check you, you're going to check him, he's going to check you, and if there's any mistake within there, then it's going to kick it back, right? So that that trust is distributed so widely that it doesn't impact any one relationship or culture or various different things. So going back to Dan Ariely, right, when he was talking about his trip to South America, and now he had buy his pen and had to go to 3 different places because the culture just didn't have that trust to have the guy who's showing you the pen sell you the pen and actually collect the money for the pen and give the pen out, right? You had to have 3 different people doing that. Doesn't matter, because now what you have is you have a distributed element where trust is parlayed out to all these different individuals, and they all have to come together. And when it all comes together, then you know it's true.
So maybe my question is adoption of distributed trust systems.
Okay.
Is it going to be slower, or will it grow at the same rate in worlds where, in environments, contexts, cultures, where there is higher corruption, for instance, using this Dan Ariely example? Because our biases are our biases.
Right.
Right. Will we simply forego hundreds of thousands of years of evolution of biases against interpersonal trust?
Of course.
Because
evolution, smevolution, right?
Yeah,
yes.
whatever. Right.
You bring up a really good point. How quickly something like this is going to be adopted in a high trust culture versus a low trust culture.
Yes.
And the fact that within a low trust culture, if the cost is minimal, right, and that's what blockchain really is getting at, is reducing all of these costs that are associated with this. I would assume, it's a big assumption, I would assume that those would probably have a higher uptake on that than others. All right.
Okay.
What else?
Wow, there was so much. Burning Man.
Burning Man.
Electronic dance music, classical music. I'm just a fan of Ori for just being such a Renaissance dude in so much of what he does and how he looks at the world.
So let's talk Burning Man, because you are planning on going to Burning Man in 2019. You've never been.
Never been.
We've talked with Caroline Webb. She brought it up. You're talking with Ori. He brought it up. So there's, of our people that we've interviewed, there's a percentage that it keeps coming up.
Yeah.
Do you think there's something magical that will happen to you at Burning Man?
It depends on
that
what
all
I
of a
barter
sudden
for.
you'll be super successful and all of these others? What?
No, but I remember talking to Dan Ariely after he went the first year.
Oh, Dan went too. There you
went
go.
as well. And he said it's a huge experiment in this barter culture. It's a big economics experiment in Dan's mind. And so that's kind of what I'm curious about. I think Caroline alluded to that in our conversation, and Ori certainly teed up this idea that it is sort of a big social experiment.
Well, it's a community. He talked about it as this community of people, and that again, getting to some of the trust. If he heard that you had been to Burning Man, he's more likely to take your call or to respond to your email.
Because we would be in tribe.
Because you would be in tribe. I think that is fascinating.
I think it's fascinating too. So.
But will that tribe maintain? Because you got some facts and figures on the numbers, right?
Yeah. So it started, in the late 80s, right, with basically two guys just saying, we're going to do this, and grabbing a couple of their friends and just doing it with no one. But by the late 90s, there was like 8,000 people going. This year there'll be 80,000 people that go to Burning Man. That's a big damn community.
Can you have a tribe of 80,000 people?
That's a really good question.
I mean, you think about the component. When it was 8,000, you can probably do that. When it was smaller, obviously that works. But is there such a cultural infusion of the Burning Man ethos that it kind of does say, yeah, if you've gone, you get it, you understand, we now have this connection? I suppose, going off on a rabbit hole here, it's like a college sport component, right? You have hundreds of thousands of people, or even a pro sport fan, right? You go into a football game and there's 60,000 people in that stadium, and they're
all there for basically for one purpose.
Well, yeah. So,
but for a very short period of time,
tribe, and if you're a Vikings fan, do you trust somebody who's a Vikings fan more than a Green Bay fan or an Eagles fan?
Pretty much, of course. There's Bob Cialdini talks about this, right? Being the helper story. With whether you're wearing a I'm a soccer fan jersey or I'm a specific team fan.
Or the opposing team, right? And who gets helped.
Yeah.
And in that, if you're wearing a jersey of the team that you support, or that the helper supports, you're more likely to be helped.
Yeah.
Versus the opposing jersey, you're less likely to be helped.
Yeah, so I think it's fascinating.
But just even in general, that larger context that he brings up, that, wow, you're a soccer fan, and so I will help you. I will be more likely to help you because you're wearing a generic soccer jersey.
So bifurcation of an 80,000 group, community is natural, right? It's going to break down into smaller groups. There are tents and pods and areas and all kinds of things like that to bring even more like-minded people into more like-minded,
smaller and smaller,
and smaller
niches,
and smaller, more relevant, more proximate, that sort of thing.
One of the things, I'm switching gears here for everybody. One of the things that we talked about when we were talking about tribes and communities with Ori, though, was this element of implied intent. And we imply the intent of people in their interactions with us. Thus, as you mentioned, I think within there, if you're within tribe, we tend to put a positive implied
good intent
upon what you're telling me, the information, what you're trying to do, versus we're very suspect of anybody out of tribe.
Right.
And I just thought that was a fascinating component. And I think that plays out in a number of arenas, political, organizational, even thinking about organizations and the element of silos within those organizations. And so I'm in the marketing department, that's my tribe, versus I'm in the sales department, that's my tribe. And so the intent that you imply upon the decisions that the other tribe makes or that your own tribe makes can vastly influence how you perceive those components.
Yeah.
And yet, going back to Cialdini, shouldn't we not wearing a marketing shirt or a sales shirt, we should be wearing the organizational shirt? And so we rise that component up to an organizational shirt.
Absolutely.
It's an interesting concept. I think we should groove on that at some point
I
in depth.
completely agree. I mean, I've got a client that I'm traveling to visit on Monday to have this very discussion about getting two very large parts of the organization to work more closely as teams, not just workmates.
Right.
Right. To go from, we work together to we are a team.
Right. So building that tribe, building that community That's interesting.
Yeah.
Love to tell us how that goes.
I will.
All right.
We'll bring that back. Okay, I have a question for you.
All right.
You use music to go to sleep by.
Yes, I do.
Do you also use music for like studying or reading or writing, or does music accompany you in any other parts of your day?
It accompanies me when I'm driving.
Good. I'm a big fan of that.
Either that or NPR or a podcast of some such. Actually, no, I don't use music per se when I'm doing work. And I don't know why. I think I could definitely do it. I think there's this element where I use music at night, and we've talked about this in other podcasts, that because it helps me take my mind off of whatever my mind is ruminating on. And I get brought into the music, and thus then I can fall asleep. When I think my concern of using music in the work component is that I will then get brought into the music as opposed to being able to focus in on what I'm doing.
Right, because at that point you actually want to be focused on writing or working or whatever, reading, whatever you're doing.
Now, that being said, that would happen if there's lyrics in there. But I wonder if there was just background music, so a instrumental type component, and setting a specific vibe or tone. If that would help, it would maybe some priming thing. I might have to run an experiment on this.
See, for me, there is no such thing as background music.
Okay.
If there's music on, I'm going to listen to it.
So obviously, you do not have music on when
no
you are.
way. I cannot have music on.
Do you have background noise? Do you need, or do you need to have headphones on or absolute silence?
I can live with a certain amount of din, I suppose, street noise or, some background. But the more there is, the more difficult it is to work. So I think about coffee shops, especially in the U.S. This is way too noisy. The whir of the machines grinding the beans and people ordering and
the conversations that are going on
at the table next door, way too much for me. No can do.
But there are a ton of people though that work in those environments and seem to do it quite effectively.
It's a damn mystery to me. I don't understand that one.
It's crazy. All right. So with that, everybody, thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this conversation with Ori and Tim and my musing on it and whatever else came into that distributed and decentralized brains of ours. And with that, keep on grooving.